My name is Mara Schwartz.
Can you spell that for me?
Maraschwartz.
And your name at birth?
It was also Mara Schwartz without the T.
Okay. Your mother and father's names?
My father's name was Rudolf Schwartz, and my mother's name was Dora Rosenkrantz.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had a sister who died when I was 5 years old.
And her name?
Her name was Ellie Schwartz.
Okay. Can you tell me where you were born?
I was born in Vienna, Austria on December 22nd, 1925.
And what was the city in Vienna or the place in Vienna? Do you remember your address?
My address was Schüttelstraße 21.
And what, did you live in a house or an apartment?
An apartment.
Remember what it looked like?
Do I remember what it looked like?
Yes.
Exactly.
Could you tell me?
Well, it was a small apartment. It had an entrance hall with the kitchen to the right. You walked into a living dining room, and it had a bedroom off the living dining room and a small bathroom off the hall.
And what was the decor? What were the colors?
I don't remember the colors.
Did you have your own room? Did you share a room?
No. My bed was, when I was little, my bed was in my parents' bedroom when I was very little. Although I don't remember it, I remember the bed somehow. I remember the crib and the side of the crib. When my sister died, and I was 5, I moved into the living dining room area, and I slept there. But until I was 5, I slept in my parents' bedroom.
And what did the living dining room area look like that you slept in?
I have to tell you that I barely remember it, and I think I made a point of forgetting it. I didn't want to remember anything about Vienna. And I think I tried to sort of blot it out. And other than some of the people who were part of my life, I remember very little.
So at that time when you're 5 years old, did you have friends that you played with? Or?
My first memory is my sister's death. I remember my parents and my aunt, my father's sister, coming home and telling me that I will not see my sister again. That's my first memory. And I don't know what it meant to me, but it was obviously the first shock in my life. My parents became very depressed. I have stories of my cousins telling me about my parents' depression. And I guess my memory is sort of being totally abandoned by my sister, whom I loved, who disappeared, and then by my mother and father, because they mourned my sister's death. Obviously, at this point, I understand it. But I think it was hard when I was 5. And then life sort of resumed normally, as it was, until I was 12. I remember the school I went to in Vienna. I went to a Volksschule in the neighborhood, and then I went to a gymnasium. I was 12 when Hitler marched into Germany, into Austria, from Germany into Austria.
Was your family very religious?
Not very. They were religious up to a point. We had all the holidays. We had a kosher house. We went to synagogue on the holidays. I don't remember going every Shabbat.
What kind of store did your father have?
My father had what was known as a dry goods store. I think he sold shirts, underwear, buttons, cufflinks, this sort of thing.
What did you do with your mother?
My mother also helped my father in the store, and I think I spent more time with friends. I had a particular friend who lived around the corner who now lives in Australia.
What was her name?
Irene. And I spent a lot of my time with her. I think that her parents had a housekeeper or a nurse or a nursemaid or whatever, and she sort of took care of the two of us. I spent a great deal of time with her.
And what did you do? Did you play certain games or with
Well,
dolls?
we used to play games about, little children in, maybe because I had male cousins and there were not too many girls around my family. I used to read a lot of Karl May, and he wrote stories about Indians and Apaches and white men who were helping Indians. And I read a lot of Karl May stories, and that's what we used to act out.
Cowboys and Indians? Or
Cowboys
just
and Indians. Well, it was not cowboys. It was, probably the white men were cowboys, but that's not how I remember it. I remember the Apaches and the Indians and the white men who were involved with the Indians, and we used to act it out. We used to play it out. And I would go to camp in the summertime, not for all summer. We would go for a couple of weeks.
And your other relatives? Do you remember what they did or where they lived?
On my father's side, the family was somewhat more sophisticated, wealthier, more traveled, more learned, and I loved them because it was like a different world, and I was fascinated by it. In some way, my cousins were more sophisticated than I was. They would go skiing, and they would do all sorts of exciting things that I only did once. As a matter of fact, the last year of my life in Austria, the winter before in February, before the march when Hitler marched into Austria, I went on a skiing trip. And all I had was my aunt's clothes, my aunt's outfit, and my cousin's skis, and they sort of outfitted me, and I went skiing with my public school. I remember the trip with the teacher and the kids from the public school.
Were you good?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I think I won the booby prize because I was the last one. We had a slalom race at the end of this week of skiing, and I came in last. And so I got the prize for being last.
The cousins, girl cousins?
Boy cousins.
Remember their names?
Oh, yes, very much so. I still see some of them, the ones that are still alive. Their name was Seidler, Harry Seidler, who is actually a world-famous architect in Australia. And his brother, Marcel, who died several years ago. But I know Marcel's children have come to visit, and I know them, I see them. And they were my closest relatives for 3 weeks.
Where?
I don't remember, but I have pictures. When we left Vienna, we had to leave very quickly, and I could carry very little. As a matter of fact, I remember sort of being told, well, you can carry whatever goes into this little suitcase, and deciding what was I going to take with me, not knowing what to take and what not to take. And I certainly took things that I barely remember what it was, but I do remember American movie stars, pictures of American movie stars. It was really a very ordinary life in Vienna. I had mostly Jewish friends, some not Jewish friends, because we went to school together. And one of my vivid memories was that once the Germans walked into Vienna, and we had to leave the school we all went to. We went to a different school where only Jewish children were taught. All my non-Jewish friends stopped talking to me. It's like I did not exist. I would see them on the street. They didn't say hello. They didn't talk to me. When I went to school, I remember, since Austria is a Christian country, they used to have a crucifix over the teacher's desk. And as soon as Hitler marched into Austria, they removed the crucifix that was over the teacher's head and put a picture of Hitler. And those are really, the memories I have left of those early years of my life have sort of been blotted out by the experience of the Austrians marching with their arms raised and yelling Heil Hitler, by the Germans walking in, by the reception of the Austrians of the Germans, by being displaced from school, by being rejected by friends. I don't think I have ever forgotten it or forgiven it. It certainly had a lasting effect on who I am. As a matter of fact, my friend Irene from Vienna, whom I had not seen for 40 years, I've seen her, a few years ago, had all kinds of memories about our life together and all kinds of things. She said, don't you remember that? And don't you remember that? And I didn't. So I clearly went out of my way to blot it all out. And as a matter of fact, when we arrived in Belgium, after Kristallnacht, we left Austria and went to Belgium illegally by crossing the border at night, I refused to speak German. My parents spoke German to me. I certainly understood it, but I wouldn't speak it. And not until they were able to understand a little French was I willing to speak again. I only wanted to speak French. And I learned it very quickly.
You learned French when you were there?
Because I was a child, and you learn it very quickly. And I wanted to learn it very quickly. I did not want to speak German. But we left after Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was in November of 1938, and we left very shortly thereafter because after Kristallnacht, my father's store was confiscated. In other words, they put a lock over it, and he could no longer enter it. So he had no way of making a living, and our apartment was confiscated. Somebody from the party walked in and took an inventory, opened all the drawers, everything that there was, whatever we had, some silverware, some linen, books, whatever there was in the apartment, a radio. He just made an inventory of everything he saw. And then he handed my mother the list, and he said, well, you have to leave by, I don't know, November 1st or December 1st, I don't remember the date, and whatever's on my list must remain in this apartment. So we had no place to live and no way to make a living for my father. And so it was time to go. I'm sure my parents left reluctantly. They were not sufficiently wise to have made arrangements in advance or to have, although they inquired about coming to America. They went to the American embassy. I think the other thing that was going on is that I was 12 years old and no one talked to me. Who ever believed that 12-year-old children in those days had any feelings or worried about things or needed to know things? So I don't really know what they did. But I do know that after that, I was told that we would leave, that I went to see my grandparents.
Where were they?
They lived in Vienna. It was the last time I saw them. They died in Theresienstadt. I went to say goodbye to some of my other relatives, and we left. We took a train, went across Germany, where there was no more border between Austria and Germany, and arrived at the border at, I think it was Aix-la-Chapelle on the French side and Aachen on the German side.
So, and do you remember the night when your parents decided that they would have to leave?
Well, it was right after Kristallnacht. I remember Kristallnacht. I remember seeing the synagogues burn. I remember walking out on the streets and seeing the synagogues burn. And I just remember the feeling of, this can't be true. Cannot happen. It can't be. And I think it was then that I decided I was just going to forget about the whole thing. That I was not going to let it superficially interfere with my life. I was not old enough to know that by pushing it down, it interferes anyway. in some other way.
When you saw the synagogues burning or burned, was this the day after, or actual you saw the fires?
I think I actually saw the fires. It's, you know, after a while, it's difficult to to be certain what you heard and what you really saw. My memory is that I really saw it. But I would not say 100% that I really saw it. But I think I really saw it. And the day after was, you know, everybody was very frightened, and everybody listened to the radio, and they listened to Hitler make these mad speeches, and I remember the sound of the voice. I cannot tell you that I remember what he said, but the sound of the voice, I mean, I could hear it in the middle of the night, and I would tell you that's what it is. It has, you know, that sound of his has never left me. And that sound has never left me, as well as the anti-aircraft sound I heard during the war. I mean, I can wake up in the middle of the night and sort of hear something and say, this is anti-aircraft. And then I said, no, it's not anti-aircraft, it's a motor on the street, but it's still in my head. I remember arriving at the border, and we had no official papers to go into Belgium. And when we arrived at the border, we were told to get, well, originally, no, that's not how it went. First, we went to Aachen, where we were supposed to make contact with someone. You see, I didn't know the details. I mean, my parents knew all of this. We were supposed to make contact with someone, pay them money, and not a lot of money, but an average amount of money. I mean, like maybe a few $100s each, you know, not thousands of dollars. We didn't have lots of money. We had a little money, you know, not very much. And so we paid the sum of money to someone who then told us how to proceed across the border. That we are to take the train to the border, get off the train at the border, not to cross the border because we had no papers to get into Belgium. You let them take care, I mean, you let them check you out on the German side, and then you start walking on the road, and you will meet two men, and you will give them the password, and they will take you across the border. And so we went to and I clearly remember getting off on the German side, getting off the train, and then being examined by the German customs, or the German border police, really, is what I'm talking about. How did they examine you? The border police. First of all, they stripped you down bare. My memory is that I was menstruating, and that they went through the pad to look for, I know what. My mother gave me one of her rings to wear. They took it off my finger, put it into a Winterhilfe box, which is like a tzedakah box, but it was for Germany. Winterhilfe is help during the winter. They threw that ring into this box. They took whatever my mother had, and then they said, now you can go. And we started walking, and we saw, I was with my mother and father at that point, just the two of us, the three of us. And we saw these two men coming down the road. But before we got to them, a German soldier ran after us and stopped my mother. I was walking with my mother, and I think my father was ahead of us. That's probably why I said the two of us instead of the three of us. I think my father was walking a little bit ahead. And he said to my mother, I know you are going into Belgium illegally. I know that it's dangerous for you. If you come with me, I can take you a quicker way that the Belgians do not know. And up, there was a big hill, there was a railroad track and a big hill, and I'll take you up there. They can't do that. They have to walk on the road, which is much more dangerous, and I'll get you to that light, and that's the light where you have to be in order to be on the Belgian side. And my mother obviously did not know what to do with this. And there was sort of this conference between my mother and father, and my father spoke to these two men who came along, who, when he gave them the password, was supposed to tell him what to do. And they told him, if this German soldier will take you across, you'll be better off with him. It is true that it's safer. He has a shorter route that we can't travel. And so we went with this German soldier who took us across the railroad track and who took us halfway up the hill, and he said, you go all the way up the hill to that light, and that's where they will meet you. They'll be there. And I often wondered why this guy did it. Did he do this every night? Did he do this? My mother was very beautiful. Did he do this because he thought my mother was beautiful? He wanted to help this pretty woman and her daughter?
Did money change hands at all?
No, he never asked for anything. Not at all. Is this something that he did, you know, every night as people came along? I have no idea. But anyway, he did it for us. We were on the other side, those two Belgian people whom my father had seen there were all the way up on that hill. A little bit later, we had to wait for a while. They led us into that house, and in that house there were other people who had gone across the border illegally, and there were like several families, a few other children. I do not remember them at all. I just remember there were more people. And then they took us, we were walking again in the dark for not very long, 10, 15 minutes. And then we were on the Belgian side, and we could take a train into Aix-la-Chapelle on the other side of the border. It's Aachen on one side, it's Aix-la-Chapelle on the Belgian side. And from then on, we were in Belgium. Now, it was known about Belgium that once you arrived, they didn't ask you where you came from. In other words, they would not allow people to work in Belgium. They didn't give working permits. They didn't allow you to have a business, but they didn't ask you where you came from. So once you were there, you were safe. And when we were in Belgium, this was in 1938, the Germans did not arrive until 1940, and the war started again, and they did not really start pursuing Jews until 42 in Belgium. So we lived in Belgium, supported by the American Joint Distribution Committee. I'm recently reading the biography of the Warburgs. And the Warburgs were very influential in creating the American Joint Distribution Committee and supporting all the refugees in Europe.
Where did you live?
We lived at first in Antwerp because my father had a brother who lived in Antwerp. And that's why we went. His brother was not able or willing to help us. I don't know which it was, but he did not. I was living with an American family. It was customary in Antwerp for Jewish families to take in refugee children. And since my parents lived in one room, and really there wasn't room for all three of us, my mother agreed to let me live with a Belgian family. The Belgian family happened to be an American family, and that's how I first heard my first English, was when I came to Belgium and lived with this American family. And they were talking English to each other, and I guess, I don't know what they were talking to me since I didn't speak French. That's when I learned it. I don't know, whatever. I was very miserable. I had never left my mother in my life. I was 12 years old, 12 and a half years old. I didn't know what hit me. And this Belgian family had a daughter my age who was a normal teenager who didn't know what hit her either when this little refugee girl showed up. I probably was crying all day long. I don't really remember, except I remember being very unhappy, particularly because I didn't understand. I didn't understand English. I didn't understand French. I didn't want to speak German. I didn't know what was going on, but I learned French very, very quickly. And I then, as soon as my parents were able to find an apartment that had 2 rooms rather than just one, I went back to live with them.
When you were alone, though, you had already started school at this time?
Well, the schooling that I had was very minimal. Because when I first arrived in Belgium, I stopped school at the age of 12 and a half in Austria. When I went to Belgium, I didn't speak the language, so instead of being promoted to the next grade, they put me back 2 grades for me to learn French. And so I learned French in those years. Antwerp was bilingual. Now it's all Flemish, but in those years it was French and Flemish. I learned French very quickly, and then they put me ahead again, but there was no time, because then, I came at the end of 1938. During 1939, I tried to learn French, and in 1940, the Germans came again. So I never really had any kind of basic education. Essentially, between 1938 and 1946, those were lost years. I lost my whole adolescence. It was never really, I had the mentality of a child, and I think I maintained that until I was 20 or something like that, when I was trying to start catching up with.
What did your mother and father do there?
Well, I think they tried to work illegally. My father sort of tried to buy things and sell things, like a traveling salesman. The things that he knew, shirts, sweaters, the merchandise that he knew, that people would let him have, and he would then go out into the country to sell to smaller stores. I'm not really sure. I think we were mostly supported by the Joint Distribution Committee. And then the Germans came again. Then the war broke out. And then my father was arrested because we had German passports. And the Belgians arrested him as a German. And they as a matter of fact, he ended up in a camp in France, I think it was called Gurs, in the southern part of France. My mother and I tried to escape to France, running away from the Germans. Not that they didn't catch up with us. They never let us cross the border. We went to the Belgian border between Dunkirk on the French side and La Panne on the Belgian side, after Ostend. They never let us cross the border because we had German passports. We were there during Dunkirk while the British were fleeing, and that's where the anti-aircraft comes from. That's when we were sitting in the basement listening to the anti-aircraft and the bombing and the British getting away in Dunkirk, returning to London. And then the next thing, when we came out of the basement, were these troops walking through again. And nobody could believe that it was the Germans, but it was. It's like we thought it was the Dutch, or who knew? Anyway, it was the Germans once again. So they caught up with us. We went back to Antwerp.
Did you have friends in Antwerp?
In Antwerp, I had friends, yes. I had some friends who were also refugees. But I didn't want refugee friends. I wanted Belgian friends. I wanted to be like everybody else. I didn't want to be a Jewish refugee. And I made Belgian friends. I went out of my way to meet Belgian friends.
What did you do with them?
Once I learned French, I sort of have this memory of discussing, being totally ignorant of lots of things, but having these philosophical discussions. French children, Belgians are like French. They talk a lot. If you know the Roma movies, the French people get together, they always have these big philosophical discussions. I'm not sure they know what they're talking about. I certainly didn't know what I was talking about. That's what I remember. And we used to always end up every discussion with tout est relatif. I mean, nothing matters. Everything is relative. And it was it made me feel like I was like everybody else. And that was more important than anything to me. Talking about this, what it makes me feel is seems to have been very little communication between my parents and me. It's like they didn't tell me anything. And I was sort of lost. And that's how I remember the years, as sort of lost and repressed. I don't know what went on. I don't know who said what to whom. I don't know who went where. I don't know why. I have sort of snatches of memories, but I can't give you a total picture of it all.
So you were in Antwerp for 2 years, and where did you go next, and how did you get there?
After Antwerp, the Germans started taking people into sort of collection areas where they then sent them on trains to concentration camps. We didn't really know what that meant, but we knew to avoid it. And so we left Antwerp, which had lots and lots of Jews living in Antwerp. And we left Antwerp and went to Tilf. And we went to Tilf, which was a small town outside of Liège, because I knew a Belgian family there whom I had met when we were trying to run away to La Panne. And in those years, once I had learned French, my parents spoke very poor French. I was sort of the trendsetter. I mean, like, whatever I said we should do, we did. And so I said, well, we got to get out of Antwerp. My father had come back from the camp. Let's go to Liège. So we went to Liège, and again, you know, you look for a Jewish community. They didn't really know what to do with us, but they said, well, if you go to Tilf, it's outside of Liège, life is cheaper, apartments are cheaper, whatever, housing is cheaper. We ended up in Tilf, and it was in 1942 when the Germans again started pursuing Jews, not only in Antwerp and Brussels, in Liège as well. At that point, we got our papers. First, I worked in a weapons factory. First, we got papers to do forced labor in the weapons factory. Again, we were separated. All the Jewish forced labor was separated in a room, and we were testing parts of weapons. And in other words, the little piece of metal that was part of a automatic rifle, let's say, I don't really know what it was, but part of something else, some weapon, had to fit through this part, but not through that part. You know, you had a gadget in your hand, it had to go through here, but not through there. Then it was the right thickness. And then you threw them into a pile. That was a good piece. And I remember we had a quota. You had to do 10,000 a day. Well, by the time, after 10, I'm not sure it was 10,000, 3,000 a day. After 3,000, we decided, well, now we're going to throw the good ones into the bad ones. I mean, we were doing sabotage even at that time, as much as we could. And that lasted for several months. At one point, the Gestapo came and wanted to take all the Jews that were working in this weapons factory and take them away. And my friend Esther, who is the one, you know, I told you, who married an American and came to this country from Antwerp, was also there. And she was, they were Belgian Jews, not refugees. And she went to the manager, the Belgian manager of the factory, and said, you know, you have a quota to make, and if you let all these Jewish workers be taken away now, you're not going to make your quota, and it's going to be bad for you. And so he decided, well, this was true, she was right, and maybe he better not let these Jewish workers be taken away so easily. And so there was a counter order. But in the meantime, those people who had already gotten onto the trucks were on the trucks. There were 5 people in front of me, mounting onto the trucks to be taken away to concentration camps, or to some camp we did not know where in those years. We just knew it was not good, but we didn't know what. And so there was a counter order. We went back to work. At that point, I decided I was not going to go back anymore, that I escaped today by 5 people, but I wasn't going to escape the next time. And so I went to somebody in Tilf I was a friend of mine, in whose house I overheard conversations about communism and underground. I heard people talk in the background. And so I decided, well, I was going to find the underground, and I was going to tell them to take care of us. But how do you find, who's the underground? How do you find the underground? So I went to, because I had overheard conversations in that household, I went to the father of this family, and I said, I'm looking for the underground. I need to be helped. I was then told that they would take care of my parents, but that while I was working at the weapons factory, I was safe. And they had too many people to take care of, and they would take care of my parents. They sent my mother and father into Liège to a contagious ward of a hospital, because the Germans don't go on contagious wards. And from there, they went to other places. My mother went to a convent, and my father was sent to via a priest to some farm in the country. I was still at the weapons factory. Then the incident happened with the truck, where I almost was taken, and then I went back and I said, I'm not going back to that factory anymore.
How old are you now?
Now I need help. And they said, yes, now we'll help you, because now we agree. It's too dangerous for you to go back, because, you know, today you escape, tomorrow they'll come back for you.
How old are you now?
This was in the summer of 43. And so I was 18, not quite 18. In the winter I would have been 18, I was 17. And then I was first sent to the mayor of the village of Tilf, who was a member of the underground. I knew his daughter, and I was up in the attic. But it was really untenable, because people came into his house, people in the village knew me, they heard steps, they felt that it was too dangerous. They had to send me somewhere else. So they sent me to another family in Liège, and I was in the back room of a family that I had never seen in my life before, and I was just sitting there crying my eyes out, because I had nothing to do. I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know where my parents were. I had friends in Brussels. I didn't know what had happened to them, who went from Antwerp to Brussels. When we went to Tilf, they went to Brussels. People sort of tried to move, thinking that if they move, they won't be found to begin with. And so I was very unhappy, and it was a very nice Belgian family, and the woman said to me, well, you know, if you're going to sit here and cry all day long, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to go to Brussels. I want to go to my friend. I can't stand being alone. So they gave me money to take the train to go to Brussels. I mean, they couldn't control me. They couldn't say, you can't go. At that point, I did not have false identification papers yet. It was at that moment that they said, well, if you're going to start traveling around, you have to have false papers instead of, you know, my regular identification paper, which everyone had in Belgium. Everybody walked around with IDs. And so I got my false identification papers, and it was at that point I mentioned to you previously that my name, the initials were reversed. They ask for your initials in order to make papers with your own initials. So in case you have anything that has initials on, you give them your real birth date, with the feeling that if somebody stops you and says, when were you born, that you're not going to remember a wrong date. You're going to remember the real date. So I had false identification papers with my birth date, a different place, obviously not Vienna, Austria. I was born in Belgium somewhere. And they reversed the initials. Instead of MS, they made it SM, and so it became Simone Mabier. And from then on, I was Simone, which was also very strange. Suddenly, Mara was gone and there was Simone. But I have to tell you, I was so confused anyway, that it was just another level of confusion. I then went to Brussels, to my friend's house. It turned out, of course, that they were also in hiding, that they already had a niece whose parents had been arrested, who was living with them, and my friend's mother certainly didn't want another child to take care of. I wasn't a child anymore, another young adult to take care of. But there was someone in where they lived, in the building, a painter, a Belgian painter, who had a young family, a son and a daughter, and he said, okay, you can come and live with me. And he used me as a model. And somewhere in Belgium there are paintings of me. I mean, he may have never sold a single one, and they may be in someone's basement. Somewhere in Belgium I was a model for a painter for a few months. And then people in the neighborhood began saying, oh, this is dangerous, you can't really keep her. you know, you have children, and what's going to happen to you? You can't do that. So they asked me to leave. So then I left again.
While you lived in this neighborhood, did they call you Simone Mabier, or did they call you...
Simone. Once I had those papers, it was Simone.
How do you
With my
spell
friends,
that?
it was Mara. With them, it was Simone. It was very confusing.
How do you spell Simone Mabier?
Simone is Simone, and Mabier was Mabiet. It went many places. And finally, my friend were arrested. The Gestapo came for them. They found them, I don't know how, but they came. My friend and his mother were taken. His father and brother were not, because they weren't home. So the father and brother were away from home, not taken. My friend and his mother was taken. They were taken to the Gestapo headquarters. They were taken to Malin, and on the train into Auschwitz or somewhere.
Your friend, what was his name?
His name was Heinz Kravitz.
And how did you meet him?
He was in the camp with my father in Gers, when all Belgian Jews were. And my father used to talk to him about me. And so when he came back, he looked for my father and for me. And that's how I met him. He was taken, and I've heard the story subsequently, and I'm not sure how, but I think it was from someone who was on the train with him. He always had planned with his brother that if they were arrested and if they were sent away on the train, they would jump the train, they would come back, they would meet each other. They always said that. And they had a place where they would meet. And his brother, who was not taken, went to that area, some park in Brussels, for weeks on end. He never came back. And subsequently, we had heard from someone who did come back that he wanted to jump, as he had promised his brother he would do, and that his mother said, "Don't leave me." This is the story I heard. And so he didn't jump. You see, I was also in contact with my parents, but never directly, because I didn't know where they were. We had a contact, and my parents would write to the contact, and I would write to the contact, and then they would exchange. The contact knew where we were. And that was done so that in case any one of us is arrested, we don't know. Nobody, I could not give away where my parents are if I didn't know where they were. And so I wrote to my mother saying that I wanted to leave Brussels once he was arrested. And I was sort of going from pillar to post. I had no reason to stay in Brussels. And my mother was in a convent. My mother was with Les Sœurs de la Miséricorde in Charneux. And my mother asked the Sister Superior if I could come there. And she said that would be okay. And so somehow, again, through the contact in the underground, they let me know. And they let me have some money so I could take a train. Then I had some incidents on the train because they stopped people all the time. But I had false papers. And there was this German soldier who sort of took my card. And, we also knew that false identification cards came from certain villages, because only certain villages were willing to provide them. And that the Germans knew that. Now, they didn't know all of the villages. So you never knew when you were arrested with a false card that the German wasn't going to figure out that this was a false card. And I was on the train to go to my mother, to the convent where she was in Charneux. And Germans checked trains all the time. Streetcars, trains. I had an incident on the streetcar as well. But I'm mixing it up. Okay, on the train, the German soldier comes by, gets everybody's identification card, and looks at them, and then he looks at mine, and he looks at me, and he looks at the card, and he looks at me, and I said, "Oh my God, what does he see?" And he suddenly gives it back to me, and he says, "Simon is a very nice name." And he gave it back to me, and he was gone. I don't know what he was looking at. I don't know, but I was very scared.
What was the incident on the streetcar?
The incident on the streetcar was I was still with my friend in Brussels. And we were on the streetcar. We all had false papers. No, this was before the false papers. This was before the false papers. Because again, the Germans stopped the streetcar, and they came looking for identification cards. And my friend and I looked at each other, and he said, "We have to get off the streetcar." And I said, "I can't get off the streetcar. The streetcar was going." He said, "Jump." And I said, "I can't jump. There's no way that I can jump off a moving streetcar." And somehow the streetcar came to a stop. And so the two of us got off that streetcar in a second and ran. And the next day we went back to see whether that was a streetcar stop. And it was not. So obviously the conductor stopped in case anybody had to get off the streetcar. I mean, this was done in Belgium all the time. You know, the people in the underground sort of knew how to foil the Germans as best as possible. And so we just got off and ran, and nobody caught up with us that one time.
Is that what made you decide to get false papers?
Well, no, I think the false papers had to do with you had to wait for them. You know, we were in the process of getting them, but you didn't get them right away. You sort of have to wait till they come through, till they're approved, etc. That incident was before papers because we didn't have any, which is why he said, "We better get off the streetcar." The convent was a children's home. It had small children. It was sort of like an orphanage, really. And my mother worked there with the sisters in the convent, doing whatever, laundry, ironing, I mean, whatever children need. And I worked with the children. But I was also very susceptible to all kinds of diseases, and any childhood disease that we went through this convent, I got. And so I got scarlet fever when I was already 18, and that's a rather dangerous illness at that age. And I was very ill. I was deathly ill, and they really didn't know what to do with me. As a matter of fact, I remember that the sisters had put all kinds of things around my neck. I don't know, garlic or onions or something. I was supposed to chase the disease away. And when the doctor came, he sort of ripped it off my neck and said, "What are you doing to this girl? She needs medication, not onions and garlic that I had around my neck." But they were very frightened that I would die, because if I did die, they wouldn't know what to do with the body. You know, I was illegally there. Well, I didn't die. I somehow recovered. Although I was very ill. I remember being really out of it for a long time. I caught all kinds of diseases. I had something called impetigo, where you have all kinds of skin. It's a skin eruption. And the medication that they had that I would put on would turn black. So I used to have this black cream all over my face. It was pretty horrendous. I had diphtheria. Like every disease that went through that children's home, you could be sure that I would get. And at one point, this is over several months, this is not a long time that I'm talking about, I sort of went from one disease to another. And then there were too many Germans in the village, and they decided they had to change us again. And I had to, you know, they were afraid that once they saw too many Germans around, that they would come, they might ask the convent, they might ask the villagers, they might ask too many questions, and they moved me again. And that's when I went to Banneux-Notre-Dame. Banneux-Notre-Dame was a small village in Belgium where the Virgin had appeared in the 30s. It was said that the Virgin appeared in the 30s, and the young girl to whom she appeared came to this priest called Louis Jamin, that was his name, and it was a recognized cult to the Virgin in Belgium. It was not as recognized as Fatima or as Notre Dame de Lourdes, but it was a recognized apparition. But I became more and more estranged from my parents as the years went by, because I felt so untaken care of. I mean, so unprotected. And that only what I did on my own sort of helped me. And I became enormously, superficially, very independent. I mean, I subsequently found out how superficial it really was, but I thought I was very independent. It was September of '44. The Germans were defeated, and I saw my first Americans. And they had in the basement a wine cellar of wonderful wine. So they were celebrating the end of the war. And we were all drinking wine. And of course, I had never had wine in my life before, or if maybe on Shabbat a sip, or on Passover 4 sips. And so I became, obviously, my tongue loosened. And I told them all that my name was not Simone, that it was Mara, and who I was. No one there knew who I was. The next day, I shared a room with one other, not refugee, another Belgian girl who worked in the company. She told me the next time, she said, you better stop pretending because we all now know who you are. I had no recollection of having said anything to anybody. But very soon, I mean, maybe not the next day, but 3 days later, I left in my usual independent way, and I hitchhiked into Liège, and I went looking again for my contact in Liège who would put me in contact with my parents, because that was in 1944, Belgium was liberated until Bastogne again, until the Battle of the Bulge. But there were no more Germans in Belgium.
I remember you saying about seeing your first American.
Yes,
What
my
was
first
that like?
American were minesweepers. They came off the hills right in front of our building.
What did
They
they
were
look like?
running down the hill, and they had minesweepers, you know, these long things with a circle at the end to find out whether the road is mined or not. Those were the first Americans I saw. And then I left the convent, I left this children's home, and I went to Liège. This was now 1944. And then I started working for the American Army.
Did you find your contact in Liège?
Yes, I found my contacts in Liège because I sort of knew where they were. And I was put in contact with my parents, who then also came to Liège. And they gave us an apartment, and we lived in Liège. I then started working for the American Army.
Did you speak to your father about his experience while he was at the farm?
Yes.
What did
yes.
he say?
My father was in the farm only for a while. And then he was in the priest's house. And in the priest's house, he was for a long time. It was also occupied by the Germans on the bottom, and he was up in the attic, and he had to pretend that he was deaf-mute so that they wouldn't talk to him, so they wouldn't ask any questions.
Okay, so it's after the war, and you're living with your mother and father.
We're liberated. I'm living with my mother and father.
And where are you living?
In Liège. And I find it very difficult. I find it very difficult to settle down to being someone's child who has to account for what she does or doesn't do or where she goes. And I found it very difficult to sort of, and I guess my parents who lost a 12-year-old thought I was still a 12-year-old, but I really wasn't. And I had had a very difficult few years, and I found it very difficult. And so I left. I left, which was really almost an unheard of thing to do because people didn't leave home. They got married. They didn't leave home. But I went to Namur, and I worked for an American PX. And I learned English. You forgot to ask me how I learned English. I didn't know English. I just sort of decided I was going to speak English, and I was going to pick it up. And I went to a lot of American movies, not dubbed, in English. And I remembered all that English I heard when I first came to Belgium and lived with this American family, and I guess it all just fell into place. And I have no memory at all of ever having learned or studied English. It's like I was born speaking English or something. I don't know. It obviously is not true. And I'm obviously forgetting what it was like, but I don't remember it. And I was in Namur during the Battle of the Bulge when the Germans came back again, and I was working for the American Army, and I was scared stiff. And everybody said, "Don't worry, nobody's going to abandon you."
What did you do for them?
I worked at the PX.
But what were your duties?
Office work. I mean, I typed, I kept records, I was just a general clerk, which also I never really learned. I just sort of picked it up. I made up some shorthand that I made up myself. I taught myself how to type on a typewriter. I mean, it's not that difficult. You just pick it up.
How fast did you wind up typing?
Wind up typing very fast, but not then. I mean, eventually I typed very fast. But again, that's not what I wanted. I wanted somehow to find a normal life. I just didn't want all this. I wanted to get away. And I married an American who was working for, he was already discharged. He was an American civilian who was working for the American Battle Monuments Commission. Whatever they did, I'm not quite sure. Putting up American battle monuments, I guess, or keeping track of them or something. And I was married in Belgium. My father was very upset because he was not Jewish. But I think they didn't quite know how to stop me. They had no way of stopping me. His name was Russ Bowman, and he was a very nice man. I was very lucky because I think I would have married anybody who asked me, and he could have been awful, but he happened to have been a very nice man. Came from Kalamazoo, Michigan, the salt of the earth. I mean, true American in every sense in all the good sense that you can ever imagine. And so was his family. I mean, they were just wonderful. But they knew nothing about Jews or Judaism. It was also a time when the Holocaust was not discussed, was not talked about. It was really Elie Wiesel who started the ball rolling with when he wrote The Jews of Silence of Russia, and he wrote his own books. That's really when it became part of the consciousness of the world. Up until then, nobody talked about it. Nobody, they were very nice to me, but if I said I didn't want to go to church, I mean, that would be bizarre. Why did you marry Russ if you don't want to go to church? He was a church-going person. And so I tried it for a while, but it wasn't me. And I did get a divorce, and it was very difficult for me, because it was very difficult for me to be alone. But I had to do it. And the first thing I did was I joined a Jewish community center. I lived in Washington, D.C. I worked in Washington, D.C. And I joined a Jewish community center in Silver Spring, Maryland, because I really lived outside.
What made you go to Washington, D.C.?
My first husband worked in Washington. He was from Kalamazoo, but he worked in Washington, D.C. We lived in Washington. I've always lived in Washington when I first came here. And I stayed in Washington until I was married until 50. I was married from 47 to 53. And I came to New York in 1954 because it was quite obvious that what I wanted was to find a Jewish husband. And in Washington, D.C., there are more women than men. And in my usual independent way, I went about finding a Jewish husband. I had to come to New York, where that's where you'll find a Jewish husband. And so I worked, when I came to New York first, I had a contact. I worked in Washington for Frieda von Reichmann, who was a psychiatrist at Chestnut Lodge. It's a private mental institution. And it was sort of the beginning of my learning about life. I learned how to set a table. I learned how to entertain, how to have friends, because I was her private secretary, and that's sort of what I did for her, but I learned it from her. And she was very attached to me, and I was very attached to her. But she understood that Washington was not the right place for me, and that I should leave and I should come to New York. And she spoke to a few people about me, and I found a job really because she had talked about me to someone. And I worked for a doctor at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. And that's where I met my husband, Lester, who was then the chief resident at Einstein in 55.
And where are your parents during all this?
My parents stayed in Belgium until 1952, when I brought them over, because they really didn't want to remain in Belgium. I was married in 47. I became a citizen in 49. they sort of felt I was their only child, and since I was here, they wanted to come here. My father died very soon after he came here. They came in 52, he died in 53. It was very hard for him to readjust to another language, another country, he couldn't quite do it. My mother was much younger than my father, and she did fine. She, was around. She knew my sons. My father never did. And so I was married in 57. And that's when I no longer needed to support myself. And the one thing I wanted to do was go to school, which I hadn't done for a long time, since I was 12 and a half. And so I took a high school equivalency exam, and then a college entrance exam, and because I had no credentials, if in order to go to college you have to have a high school diploma, but I've never gone to high school. So I had to take all these exams, and then they didn't quite know what to do with me because I had okay test results, but I had none of the background. So they decided to send me to the French department, so they should evaluate what to do with me. And so at that point I spoke English quite well, and I walked into the French department speaking not French but English. I don't know why. It was easier for me, since French is not my mother language. You see, I rejected German, but French is not my mother language. So although I speak French, doesn't come naturally to me. And so the first thing the man said to me is, "Where did you learn English?" And I said, "I didn't." "Where did you study English?" I said, "I didn't. I just picked it up." He said, "You'll be fine. You'll pick up anything. We'll take you. You don't have to do any prerequisites. Just start college. You'll pick it up." And so I started at Hunter until I was pregnant with my first son. And then I dropped out and had 2 children. And then when they no longer needed me, 10 years later, after I went, through having both as small children, I went back to school and didn't really graduate until 76.
How old are you then?
I was born in 25. In 76, I was 50. Yes. And so that's when I started feeling, I had to have a job. Now that I've gone to college, I have to have a job. And that's when I took a computer course. And I went to, but it was really not until I had children that I began feeling that I had to pull together what I wanted to pass on. And that I had to decide who I was. And although my early years really sort of left me almost incapable of, I think, the trauma of not having had an adolescence. I really didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was interested in. I didn't, it's when you are 17 and 18 that you read something that turns you on. Those are the years that make you who you are. You learn from literature. You learn from, none of this has happened to me. And so I was really very, very detached. And it's having children that made me feel that I had to become attached to something that I can pass on. And that's when I started learning about Jewish things and Judaism. And I became very active in the Reconstructionist movement, which is, it's one of the Jewish branches you don't hear much about. It's not conservative, it's not Orthodox, it's not Reformed, it's Reconstructionist. But it meant a great deal to me because it is very traditional in form, but it reinterprets the meaning of the tradition into, more modern, more rational sensibilities that I have acquired over the years, rather than the old-fashioned way of looking at religion and God. And so I guess the only feeling that I have is that because of my need to prove that if Hitler had killed me, none of this would have happened. what I do now has to be in defiance of it all. I have to prove that there was a reason for surviving, because otherwise the guilt for having survived is very difficult. And the reason for surviving is to have Jewish children and Jewish grandchildren. That's quite a burden to put on your children. But I can't help it. There it is.
So you took a computer course.
Yes.
And what did you wind up doing?
I ended up working for the New York Stock Exchange, writing application software. And I was there for 9 years, close to 9 years, not quite 9 years. And I'm now working at the Jewish Museum as the coordinator of volunteers. It's a volunteer job. I think I'm the only coordinator of volunteers in the city of New York, a cultural institution that does it on a volunteer basis. Most people, it's a paid job in most institutions. And I love it. I think it's wonderful. I like to be there. I like the people. I love to be appreciated for what I do. I mean, you know, when you have a job where everybody says thank you, no matter whether you come or whether you don't come, whatever you do, it's wonderful. And I think I'm doing a good job. It's not just that they say thank you.
I'm sure. And do you have children?
I have 2 sons. One, my oldest son, is going to be 35, and he was married 2 years ago.
His name?
His name is Ralph David Schwartz, and his wife is Victoria. And my younger son is going to be 30 in a couple of weeks, and his name is Theodore Harold Schwartz.
And what do they do?
Ralph is in restaurant management, has studied in France for many years, and is now working in New York. And Teddy is a resident in neurosurgery at Columbia.
Any grandchildren?
No, not yet.
If there's one thing that you'd like to say before we end the interview, is there anything specific you'd like to tell everyone that's going
Well,
to
I
get
also
to view
want
this?
to tell you about my husband.
Yes, please do.
My husband is a psychoanalyst. I'm going to cry before I continue. And he's given me more. He's given focus to my life and purpose and a lot of joy, which I would have never had without him. And 2 wonderful sons. And I wish I could stop crying.
What are some of the favorite things you like to do with your husband?
Well, most of the things that we do are really things that he loves, that I've learned to love through him. He loves opera and music. We love to go to movies and fine food, lots of nice restaurants and good home cooking. And going for a walk on the beach, which he loves more than I do, but I do it.
Which beach?
Oh, we have a house in East Hampton. Oh, and gardening. He loves gardening. I love the house, but...
What kind of house is it?
It's a house right on the water, on the bay. It's very beautiful. And we have lots of nice vegetables and flowers that he grows.
Who decorated the house?
We do it together. Yes, we do all of this together. We always have a saying that if one of us doesn't like it, we don't buy it. We have to both like it. Otherwise, out it goes. Or we don't have it. I was thinking, before you came, I said to myself, why am I doing this? I'm still not sure why. And I'm actually afraid to look at it. I think I'm going to look at the tape and I'm going to say, oh my God, this can't be me. But I'm going to have to look at it. I won't ignore it. And I suppose I sort of feel grateful that Steven Spielberg decided to do all of this. And I have a feeling that it probably is as altruistic on his part as it seems to be. I mean, I have a sense that it really is, that he just decided this was a good thing to do. And maybe it is. I hope it is. That's it. It didn't all come together in a way until I got married and had children, when I sort of felt like I had to pull it together in some way. And that's what I did. I went to school, I became educated, I learned about Judaism, I learned about being Jewish. I wanted. You told me I would need it. I wanted my children not to feel about being Jewish as I felt, that it was difficult, terrible, persecution. That's not what I wanted to pass on. I wanted to pass on that it was joyous, that you could celebrate holidays, that you could learn what it means to be Jewish in a positive sense. That to be Jewish has to do with being generous, giving tzedakah, taking care, learning about contributions of Judaism to Western civilization. I wanted all the positive parts of it. And the only way to do it is to learn about it. I knew nothing about it. I mean, I was a little girl, I went to synagogue, I sort of used to ask my father questions, and he would say, well, we do it because we're Jewish. Well, what does that mean? I knew nothing. And I suddenly realized I couldn't pass it on unless I learned something. And so I went out and learned. I had to know about it. And what I wanted to pass on was the good part of it. I didn't want them to be Jewish because we are persecuted. I wanted them to be Jewish because we celebrate it, because it's a good thing to be. And it wasn't really until I hit that point that I sort of feel like I was able to pull it all together, who I was and what I wanted to do.
Where do you feel it?
All right, this is my husband Lester, my son Ralph, my son Teddy, and my daughter-in-law Victoria.
Asking the children, what we like to ask them is, do you have anything you'd like to say about growing up as the child of a survivor? Start with.
I have some memories that I was thinking about as I drove over here. I thought I might mention. One was, I guess, the first time when I realized what my mother had been through. That when I was a child growing up, whenever she would talk about her experiences during the war, they always seemed like adventures to me. And I would always want to hear more about these adventures that, I would like things you would see on television. And my mother wouldn't talk about them that frequently, only on certain occasions. And I recall the first time I really realized that they weren't just adventures was when I was at a Hebrew school class, and they had asked my mom to come speak. And I was sitting there with all my friends, and she was up in the front in our synagogue, and she started speaking about what had happened to her. And I remember she started crying. And my whole mood just instantly changed, because I was initially sitting there very excited with my buddies and wanting to hear what she said, and sort of, hey, cool, check out what my mom went through, And once she started crying, and it was obvious that these were such somber memories and such serious memories that it wasn't just, they weren't just adventures anymore, but they were real experiences that I had to think about, and think about her in the context of those experiences. And I think they have definitely shaped this whole household. And growing up in this household, sometimes, and usually in unspoken ways, but occasionally in spoken ways. And there was something else I was thinking about was, whenever we are interested in a new experience, or excited about doing something new, or sort of taking risks, I guess, or traveling somewhere that might be dangerous, or engaging in some activity that has some sort of risk, or putting ourselves in some sort of situation that would be uncomfortable and unpleasant to be in, either emotionally or physically, I always had the sense that my mother her first impression was, why are you doing this? Why are you escaping from this comfortable place that we've created to put yourself...
Why go out of your way to do that?
Yeah. Because I think to my mom, it was so important for her to be comfortable and to be surrounded by warmth and to feel like things were secure, and we were constantly running away from that security and trying to experience new things and do new things, and I think it was, obviously she let us do them ultimately because she's a great mom, but with a little trepidation at first and a little sort of lack of understanding. And
Maybe
then
more than a little trepidation.
Which she tried to hide, if she could.
Next.
Well, I think whereas, I think whereas my brother's experiences with my mom's storytelling, or my mom's experiences, was sort of perceiving it as adventure and sort of seeing it as something to find out more about. I think I may have been more intuitive in terms of recognizing that it was something that was painful to her, and as a result would hear about it once or twice and then not really push it any further, not want to hear more about it, or be interested in hearing about it, but then in the same way that she would sort of step out of her daily persona, talk about what it was like then, and then step back into her daily persona, I would share in that experience and then forget about it. In the same way that she would forget about it, I'd say, oh, okay, fine, and then go ahead as if we hadn't had this conversation until it would come up again. But I also think that being the firstborn and the first one to want to go out and do different things, or the types of things that my brother was just speaking of, I was the first one to have her say, don't do that. I was a very, at least from what I've been told of my very early childhood, very active, very aggressive, and I was always constantly getting into things and running around and being very physical, and that was very anxiety-provoking for my mother, because she wanted me to be just the way I was and very safe and very calm, and I'd be climbing the fence or running down the fence or running across the street or something, and she'd be screaming after me or whatever. I'm sure that I reacted to that. She would say no, and I would say yes, and she would say no, and I would say yes, and then that would manifest itself in any one of a number of different ways. I spent a number of years riding and racing motorcycles, which made her very, very happy, I'm sure. And doing things like that, I guess, because there was a pervading sense that you shouldn't do that stuff, or it's not good to do, or why go out of your way for that. And, my mother went to such extremes and to such extents to give us a sense of security that we would just take it for granted.
Talk for far more than you have tapes, because it's, I think, turned out to be, I think when we got married, although I knew about Mara's background, at that point, and that was in the late 50s, I don't think I yet had any true sense of what the effect was going to be on everybody, what the effects really were for Mara and what they would be for all of us. That is something that developed over time. I think at the very beginning, I think it was Mara wanted very much to be American and wanted very much to put what had happened to her behind her. It became evident, particularly once we had children, and as her own sense of the past began to sort of crash in on her, it became evident that that was not going to be possible. And it started really a whole, there were certain books that she read, and certain which would lead to her weeping for periods of time, and things that she couldn't possibly watch on television, and are gradually becoming more involved in Judaism, or wanting to have some sense of Judaism for our family and our children. And as the years went on, it became more and more clear of just what it meant to be a survivor, and that it's something that it's pervasive. It affects the life of the survivor forever, and it affects the children as well. The children of survivors live in a different world than the people around them. And I think our children who grew up with, comfortable Upper West Side families, comfortable schools and so forth, began gradually to have a sense that they really were different from the other children, as much as they might have tried not to be, because their background was something totally different from what their friends' families, friends' mothers, had any sense of. So I think I'm a psychoanalyst, and over the years I've worked with people also who have had this experience, and I know how that it is, people who are survivors lead a different life from the people around them. They're never safe.
These are pictures of my grandfather and grandmother who were killed in Theresienstadt. His name is Alte Jankel Rosenkrantz, and her name was Zipporah Rosenkrantz. This picture was taken at the wedding of my mother's youngest brother. In the foreground, I'm a little girl of about 10 or 11. The bride and groom are, on each side of the bride and groom are my grandfather and my grandmother. In back of them is my mother and father, and on their side are my mother's sister and her husband, and my mother's brother and his wife. This was really the closest family I had in Vienna, and I was the only grandchild. This is a picture of my mother and father and me just before I left Belgium to come to this country. It was taken approximately in 1946. This is a picture of my friend Heinz Krawitz, who was killed in Auschwitz. This is my uncle, my mother's older brother, who was killed in a concentration camp, but we don't know which one.
What's his name?
I blocked on his name. His name was Bruno Rosenkrantz. This is actually the yellow star I wore. I think it was first given to me in 1942 when I lived in Tilf, and I had to wear it on all my outer clothing every day. This is Sœur Marie Gonzague, who was of the Order of Les Sœurs de la Miséricorde in Charneux, and she was particularly nice to my mother when she was in the convent, and I knew her well. This is a picture of a priest whose name was Louis Jamin. He was l'Abbé Jamin, and he was very instrumental in helping me at the end of the war, the last few months of the war. I remained in correspondence with him for many years until he died in '61. This was the village priest in the village of Charneux, in whose house my father was hidden when he was in the upstairs of his house, and he had to make believe he was deaf and dumb because the downstairs was occupied by the Germans.
His name?
I don't know. This picture was taken in 1946 before I left Europe to come to America, and seems like a very strange person to me. This picture was taken a year or so after I came to this country, and it seems to me like my attempt to look American. Not too bad. This is taken in 1987 when Ralph graduated from a school in Paris, and he posed for this picture very reluctantly, although he looks like he's enjoying it.
I want to show these again.
This was also taken in 1987 when Teddy graduated. When was this taken, Lester?
Several.
Oh, this was taken in Vancouver, at a dinner in Vancouver.
The upper pictures were taken in St. Bart, I think.
And the upper pictures were taken last year in St. Bart.
Who is
Yes.
this?
This is Lester, and down below is Lester and I. These pictures were taken of my sons growing up. I think Ralph is in high school, and so is Teddy a few years later. This is a high school picture. Yes.